Title: The Fall of Grumbaraz. Long after the War of the Ring, when the lands of men turned to rebuilding and the memory of Mordor faded, something stirred deep in the withered heath beyond the grey mountains. From beneath its scorched ridges emerged a host, not of orcs or goblins, but of Allag-hai, the last and most terrible breed of troll. Unlike their dull-witted kin, these were cunning, disciplined, and armored like siege towers. Their skin was mottled iron and obsidian. Eyes yellow and sunken. Some stood 3 times the height of a dwarf and bore weapons meant to level walls, not spar in combat. Their leader, known in whispers as Gerdhak the Tower Breaker, wielded a pillar of granite as a mace and wore the skull of a dragon on his shoulder. Driven by a dark will, whether Sauron's remnants or some new evil, these monsters marched on Grumbaraz, a high mountain stronghold of the Iron Fist dwarves. Grumbaraz was ancient, carved before the First Age ended, hidden in the jagged peaks of the Far East. It held one of the last true flame forges, where red steel, iron infused with volcanic heart fire, was still shaped. The dwarves of Grumbaraz were secretive, stubborn, and feared no darkness. Until they saw the Allag-hai. Scouts returned with eyes wide in terror. Captain Doric Firevane, war chief of the Gates, could barely speak. "They walk in daylight. And they speak our names." Within a day, the tremors began. From the horizon, a thunder not of storm but of feet. Hundreds of Allag-hai advanced in formation, flanked by war beasts and black-armored hill trolls. Their skin glinted like rock in the sun. The dwarves manned the gates, hundreds strong, but even the bravest knew this was no ordinary siege. Doric looked to the elders and said simply, "We hold, or we fall." On the first day, the trolls reached the lower gates and began their assault. Great towers of stone and bone rolled forward, pushed by slave ogres. Giant battering rams, made from whole trees wrapped in chain, crashed against the stone. But Grumbaraz's outer walls were rune-sealed. They held. Archers from the battlements loosed bolts the size of javelins, and war machines hurled firebombs laced with sulfur. Still, the trolls came. Then, at dawn of the third day, the mountain shook. Gerdhak stepped forward, dragging his granite mace. With a roar that shook snow from the cliffs, he struck the gate himself. The stone cracked. Each blow was like a drumbeat of doom. By nightfall, a breach formed. The dwarves had one chance. The Forge Guard, elite warriors clad in red steel, charged into the breach, axes blazing. They met the Allag-hai head-on. Doric led them, shouting war songs as his hammer crushed the knee of a towering troll. He was struck back, his shield splintered, but rose again. Beside him fought Runa Stoneward, the forge's master smith, wielding twin flame axes that hissed as they touched Allag flesh. She severed a troll's wrist, ducked a hammer swing, and leapt into its chest with a scream. But the enemy was endless. Inside the halls, the dwarves triggered traps, collapsing tunnels, igniting chambers filled with oil. Dozens of trolls died screaming in fire. And yet the trolls learned. They pulled the wounded aside, they flanked the halls. They spoke in a tongue filled with pain, coordinating their assault. By the 7th day, the main forge was breached. Gerdhak entered. Twice the height of any dwarf, his mace glowing with the heat of broken stone, he roared, "Burn this place to ash!" Doric stood in his path. They clashed like titans. Mace to warhammer. Stone to steel. Every blow shook the mountain. Every step crushed a pillar. Doric fought with fury, until Gerdhak caught his hammer mid-swing, lifted him by the beard, and hurled him into the molten pit. Runa screamed. She leapt at Gerdhak, axes flying. She severed his hand, but not before his other arm swept her into the anvil wall. With their leaders dead, the dwarves fell back, sealing the upper halls. And in a final act of defiance, the High Smith lit the core of the flame forge. The mountain erupted inward. Grumbaraz collapsed in smoke and fire, burying both troll and dwarf in stone. Weeks later, explorers found nothing but ash and shattered ruins. But in the deepest caverns, they say a single echo remains, a heavy, slow heartbeat beneath the stone. And a voice, low and grinding. "We will rise again."
The Red Snow of Gundabad, a grim tale of honor, blood and survival deep in the northern wastes of Middle-earth. The snow fell red that day, not from the sky, but from wounds opened in silence, in frost and in rage. The dwarves of Ironfoot had not returned to Mount Gundabad in nearly a century. Once a sacred site of ancestral memory, now it lay shattered, broken in a goblin war that left half the mountain uninhabitable and the rest poisoned with memory. Still, Tharkun Stonearm, elder of his clan, had demanded they return to bury his brother, last of their bloodline lost at Gundabad. He would not rest until the Stonearm name was sealed into the rock itself. They numbered only 15, miners, guards, bearers, no war band, just kin. But Gundabad had not forgotten them. They crossed the frozen crevasse under a burning sky. Winter screamed through the hollow teeth of the mountain's peaks. Bones jutted from the ice, goblin, dwarf, or beast. It no longer mattered. At the edge of the old tomb hall, they found it unsealed. Tracks, small, light, fast. Goblins, Tharkuns. Nephew Broldy spat. They nest here now, like rats in a grave. Tharkun knelt before the broken stone gate. He traced the old carving of the ancestor rune, now defaced with crude symbols and dried blood. "We bury our dead," he said, "and then we clean the rot." The dwarves pushed into the hall with torches raised. Black soot still stained the walls. Smoke marks from the last battle never faded. But the goblins had not rebuilt. They had infested tattered cloth, greasy bones, the stink of wet fur and filth. As they laid the stone-arm body to rest beneath the old forge altar, the air grew colder, too cold. A howl, not wind. Goblins struck. From above, their wiry limbs clinging to the rafters, blades drawn, shrieking. The first dwarf fell before he could draw his axe. 2 more were pulled into the dark, screaming. The hall erupted, torches dropped, steel flashed, snow from the broken ceiling drifted inward like falling ash. Tharkun stood with axe drawn, spinning beneath the shadow of the forge fire brazier. "Fall back to the stone path!" The dwarves formed a half-circle around the central pit. Goblins swarmed from the walls, from floor cracks, from behind stone columns. Dozens, maybe hundreds. It wasn't an ambush. It was an execution. One of the dwarves, Harnir, dropped his shield and lit the oil flasks instead. "If we die here, they burn with us." He hurled the flask into the rafters. Flame roared across mouldy beams. Goblins screamed as fire turned their ambush to chaos. But stone cracked with it. The roof began to shake, then collapse. The chamber split. Half the dwarves were buried under ice and rubble. Tharkun was thrown into a side shaft with Broldy and 3 others. Darkness, then dripping. The ice cave below Gundabad was not mapped, not by goblins nor dwarves. But the 2 races now crawled through it, bleeding, dying, and fighting in bursts of flame and shadow. For hours they fought, in tunnels no taller than a dwarf's back, in pockets of black water, through dripping. Stalactites and rock that groaned under every step. Broldy's arm was torn open. He wrapped it in chainmail. 2 dwarves fell to goblin spears in the dark. Tharkun never stopped moving. They reached a stone vent that led back up. The goblins followed, now shrieking not with hunger, but fear. The fire had spread. The mountain was groaning, cracking. Tharkun turned at the last bend. Goblins poured through the tunnel mouth. He looked to Broldy. "You go." Broldy grabbed his arm. "You're old, not mad." But Tharkun was already lighting the flask. "Tell them the stone arms held." He ran into the dark. The explosion sealed the shaft. When Broldy clawed his way from the cave mouth, the next. Dawn, frost covered his beard, and a red haze still drifted from the cracks of Gundabad. No song was sung for Tharkun. No tomb was built. Only stone, only silence, and blood in the snow.
They reached the black gate. Mordor was silent. Victory was close. Then the mountain cracked open, and 100,000 rose from beneath the ash. Year 1093 of the Third Age. Gondor had not yet faded. Its armies stretched from Pelargir to the northern hills. Its ships rode the Anduin like silver blades. Its towers still gleamed with Númenórean stonecraft, and its kings still believed in final victories. It was in this age that the High Warden of the North, General Alcaron of Calenardhon, was sent to finish what the last alliance had begun. Wipe Mordor from the map, not to guard it, not to watch it, to end it. The advance to the Ash Plain. Alcaron's column, left from the rebuilt fortress of Durthang, reclaimed years prior in a bloody siege. From there they crossed the Sea of Ash, black plains where nothing grew and even birds would not fly. They numbered 12,000, swordsmen of Minas Tirith, armored head to toe, horse archers of Ithilien, swift and deadly engineers and siege masters with towers of polished steel, and Alcaron's personal guard, who carried no banners, only blades. For weeks they marched beneath the shadow of Ephel Duath, the mountains of shadow. They passed old battlefields, burned bones, and watchfires that had long since gone out. But they heard no horns, saw no scouts. Mordor was silent. The gate. On the 7th morning they arrived at Morannon, the Black Gate, vast, ancient, and still scorched by the fires of the War of the Last Alliance. To their shock, it was open, not broken, not burning, just open. Alcaron ordered scouts forward. The gate was undefended. The massive doors creaked in the wind as if awaiting them. "This is no trap," said Lord Hadrin, commander of the vanguard. "It's worse than that. It's a challenge." But Alcaron believed it a sign. He believed they had come at the right time. That evil had finally withered. He was wrong. The march into Mordor. They entered in 2 columns, cautious but hopeful. The air was dry, the sky cloudless. Mount Doom loomed far to the south, quiet like a volcano, long dead. Inside the Black Gate was a barren plain, miles wide, choked with slag hills and stone ridges. They called it the Flats of Gorgoroth, where orc armies once marched like rivers of black. Now it was dust. Alcaron ordered a forward camp built beneath a ridge. Siege towers were positioned. Signal flags rose. They were preparing to move deeper toward Barad-dûr's ruins. They had come for the heart, but the heart beat still. The mountain opens. It began at dawn, a low rumble like a stone rolling in a dry cave. Then the ground shook. A slab of the northern ridge collapsed, revealing not rock, but a massive carved gate, blacker than iron, inset with rusted glyphs. The gate of Duraug Dum, the mouth of the mountain. It was no volcano. It was a fortress beneath the ash, forgotten by all but those who had hidden there for over 1,000 years. Out of it came drums and fire and orcs, tens of thousands. They poured from tunnels hidden beneath the very camp where Gondor's engineers stood. Some rose from vents masked as craters, others from collapsed mines they had mistaken as ruin. Alcaron's men were surrounded before the signal flags could fall. The ambush. The first wave hit like a storm. Orcs with blackened iron blades coated in oils and poisons swarmed the siege lines. They wore no armor, but carried shields carved from bones. Their eyes gleamed red in the firelight. In the center, giants of stone skin, chained and screaming, charged forward. Siege towers fell before they could fire. Horses bolted. The wind carried smoke, and worse, the cries of men dying in the fog. Alcaron mounted and ordered a retreat to the inner ridge, but it was too late. They were cut in half, their rear guard overrun in minutes. He realized the truth. Mordor had never been empty. It had been waiting. The last stand at fire's edge. They held the western edge of the ridge for hours, rallying beneath a broken statue of Elendil. Archers lined the rock, hurling fire down. Dwarves from the Iron Hills, who had marched with Alcaron in rare alliance, held a narrow defile with axes and grit alone. Let them come in threes or in hundreds, one dwarf spat. They'll leave as halves. But it wasn't enough. By nightfall, the orcs had brought trolls chained to burning carts, rolling through the center like siege rams. The sky turned red, not with flame, but with ash stirred from below. Alcaron himself was struck by an arrow through the shoulder. Still he stood, hammer in hand. The decision. On the third day, bitter wind rose, the smoke thinned, and for the first time they saw how deep they had been pushed back. They stood not before the gate, but at its threshold again, and the black gate, once open, was now shut. Worse, sealed from the inside. "We are the ones outside the walls now," Alcaron said, "and this land has teeth again." The commanders argued. Some called for a push, others begged for withdrawal. In the end, Alcaron chose to save who he could. They left the wounded in a circle of shields, burned the siege towers, and retreated across the ash plain under cover of the fourth night. The aftermath. Only 3,000 returned. Of the 12 banners, only 4 made it home. Gondor never returned to Mordor again in full force, not until the days of Aragorn. And what they left behind, the craters, the scars, the bones, would one day serve as warning, not memory. And so the Black Land lived wounded, but breathing still. This was the battle that almost ended Mordor, but almost is not enough.
The winds that blew across Dagorlad carried no birdsong, only ash, smoke, and the whisper of war long overdue. In the 34th century of the Second Age, the Great Plain stretched like a scar before the black gate of Mordor, dry and dead. Here, where the brown grass curled and withered underfoot, the armies of the last alliance gathered, their banners flapping like wings of fate. They came from lands spread across the map of Middle-earth, a force forged not by kinship but by purpose. At the head of them stood Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, his armor gleaming silver, the spear Eglos in his grasp like a frozen star. At his side, Elendil the Tall, last of the lords of Andunia, towered in Númenórean steel. Behind them surged elves, men and dwarves, free peoples bound by one shared oath, the defeat of Sauron. From the west had marched the elves of Lindon, archers and swordsmen, veterans of wars older than memory. Born near the Grey Havens, their songs were of starlight and silence, but today their eyes burned with wrath. South of them came the wood elves of Lorien, cloaked in forest green, silent, swift, deadly. Unlike their highborn kin, they needed no fanfare, only room to draw blood. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm, seldom seen beyond their mountain gates, had emerged from under the misty mountains, armored in stone, dark iron, and bearing axes that shimmered with ancient runes. Gruff, proud but unshakable, they had offered no promise of loyalty, only a promise of vengeance. And then came the men of Númenor in exile, divided yet united. From Arnor in the north rode the grim-hearted warriors of Isildur, their dark cloaks fluttering over bright mail. From Gondor in the south, Anarion's legions arrived with siege engines and discipline. They were not many, but they were mighty, descendants of a drowned kingdom, standing now in exile, fueled by loss. Their enemy needed no beauty, no glory, only numbers and fear. The orcs of Mordor spilled out of the broken lands like infection. They chanted in twisted tongues, banners of red and black rising like smoke. For every elf there were 10 orcs, for every dwarf 20. They came armed with crude blades, rusted armor, and hatred born in darkness. Behind them lumbered trolls, dragging hammers and chains, each a siege engine in flesh. In their wake marched the Easterlings, adorned in red lacquered armor, warriors of the East, drawn by promises of dominion. And from the burning south, the South Rons, Haradrim, roared into the field astride beasts from forgotten deserts, eyes wild with fire. Above it all, the shadow of Barad-dûr watched. The first arrow was loosed at dawn, a single shot from a Lindon scout, silent and swift. It struck an orc commander in the eye. He dropped shrieking, and the field erupted. From the front lines, elven archers unleashed volleys in perfect timing, arrows blotting out the rising sun. The orcs screamed but pressed forward. Their war drums pounded, a terrible rhythm that shook the earth. The charge met the alliance like a storm against stone. Gil-galad stood amidst his royal guard, wielding Eglos like wrath incarnate. Every strike left frost-kissed corpses in his wake. His voice carried over the chaos, shouting orders in the high tongue, pushing his lines forward. Beside him, Elendil fought like a tidal wave, his sword Narsil cleaving through meat and mail. To the left, the dwarves broke into a phalanx, shields locked, axes swinging with mechanical brutality. An orc warband tried to flank them, and was simply erased. Blood slicked the dirt where they stood, but the dwarves held. The center, where the armies of Gondor and Arnor met the tide, surged forward. Isildur, cloaked in black, fought with fury, unmatched. His brother Anarion held the standard of the White Tree high above the chaos. Together they led charges that pierced deep into the enemy's mass, leaving wreckage behind. But the dark had its own champions, a troll the size of a watchtower, smashed into the eastern flank, tossing elves aside like dolls. A group of Southrons, screaming war cries in guttural tones, surged toward the archers of Lorien. Dozens fell. The alliance buckled, but did not break. Gil-galad saw the breach and charged. With a dozen of Linden's elite, he carved through. The horde like moonlight through fog. Eglos sang in his hand, every thrust freezing blood mid-air. And when the troll turned its hateful gaze upon him, Gil-galad met it head-on. The duel was short and fatal. The elf king drove his spear beneath its jaw, and the monster fell like a felled tree, shaking the battlefield. Cheers rang out, but none louder than from the dwarves who had seen it all. Still, the tide seemed endless. Every wave of orcs that fell was replaced by another. The skies turned black not from clouds, but from the smoke of blood and burning. For hours the field saw nothing but slaughter. Bodies piled high, men and orcs, elves and easterlings. And yet the alliance did not falter. They rotated ranks, mended the wounded mid-battle, and pushed ever forward. They were not fighting for conquest, but for survival, for peace, for the future. When the sun dipped low, Sauron's armies began to waver. For all their numbers, their morale was fragile. The death of their commanders, the stubbornness of the dwarves, the ferocity of the elves, and the unwavering courage of men began to crack their resolve. Gil-galad raised his spear high. "Elendil!" Now, the Númenórean king charged, his sons at his side, and the alliance surged with him. The lines of Mordor buckled. The trolls, now fewer, turned and fled. The Southrons retreated into the smoke. Even the orcs began to falter. When the final war horns of Mordor died in the air, silence fell like a curtain. The field was no longer a battlefield. It was a grave. Tens of thousands lay dead. Gil-galad's armor was dented and painted with soot. Elendil's sword was chipped. Isildur knelt beside a friend who no longer breathed, and yet they had won. The battle of Dagorlad was over, but it was not the end. From the Black Gate, Sauron had not emerged. His forces had been broken, but not he. The victory was great, but the war, they knew, had only just begun.
Title: The Black Blood Uprising. Not all orcs obeyed. Some remembered what they were before the Uruk-hai came. They met in the ash wastes of Gorgoroth, beneath skies veiled by smoke and silence. No horn sounded. No banners flew. Just steel, rot, and vengeance. The Uruk-hai had gathered, thousands strong, marching east to seize the old fortresses abandoned after Sauron's fall. Clad in blackened plate, standing taller than any man, they moved with ruthless unity. But this day, they did not face elves or dwarfs. They faced their own. The Black Blood clans, older, wilder, orcs born of the mountains, not bred in vats. Their skin was grey-green and scarred. Their armor was scavenged. Their eyes burned not with obedience, but memory. And at their front stood Grushnak One-Eye, an ancient orc chieftain with a rusted blade, cracked tusks, and a war-paint skull helm. He raised his arms and shouted across the wastes. "You think yourselves strong? You're slaves made in steel." The Uruk-hai commander stepped forward. Karzag the Boundless, broad as a troll, his halberd dragging across the earth. "And your carrion," he growled. It began with a charge. Grushnak's wolves sprinted from the cliffs, barbed chains clanking. Black blood berserkers leapt from crevices, screaming ancient war cries. They had no formation, only fury. The Uruk-hai did not flinch. They closed ranks, shields braced, pikes lowered. Steel met flesh. The wolves fell first, impaled on the Uruk line. Berserkers slammed into shields, swinging cleavers and burning axes. Blood splashed across the black stone. Grushnak roared, cleaving a helmeted Uruk from neck to jaw. But for every Uruk that fell, 2 black bloods died. They were older, fiercer, but fewer. Behind the Uruk lines, something stirred. From the cliffside, old orc shamans emerged, frail, shaking, chanting in black speech. They called on fire, on wind, on the old spirits beneath Mordor. And the wind answered. Ash storms howled across the battlefield. Dust blinded the Uruk ranks. Soot choked their commands. The black blood struck again, this time from the flanks. Karzag snarled. He lifted his halberd and shouted one word. Burn! The rear ranks released their fire bombs, crude, volatile, brutal. The ash storm caught the flame. The battlefield exploded. Dozens from both sides burned. The air turned red. Grashnak staggered through the smoke, one arm burned, blood in his throat. He saw Karzag across the field, untouched, towering. The Uruk general walked calmly through fire, stepping over corpses. His halberd dragged a trail of blood. Grashnak charged. They met with a crash like falling stone. Blade met halberd. Bone cracked. Grashnak screamed curses from the old tongue. Karzag fought without words, a machine, unrelenting. They traded blow for blow until Grashnak's blade snapped. Karzag raised his weapon for the kill. But Grashnak laughed. From his belt, he pulled a rusted dagger, carved with the sigil of the first Orc tribe, the ones Morgoth had twisted long before Sauron rose. You may be stronger, he growled, but I remember what we were. He plunged the dagger into Karzag's neck. The Uruk staggered, roaring, blood spraying. Grashnak collapsed beside him, grinning through broken teeth. The Uruk line wavered. The black blood surged again, their last push. But it was not enough. The Uruk High, enraged by their general's fall, advanced with methodical slaughter. Black bloods were crushed, burned, skewered. The shamans were torn apart. By dusk, only a handful survived. A week later, in the ruins of the battlefield, a blackened banner stood planted in ash. On it, someone had painted in blood. We do not forget. Some say the Uruk High now patrol their own with more suspicion. And some whisper that deep in the mountains, more black bloods gather, not to fight elves or men, but to take back their name.
The day fire fell, the wind carried heat before the fire. Balin tasted it before he saw it. Iron, smoke, and something fouler, old ash. He stood on the outer ramparts of Erebor, scanning the horizon. The sky was unusually pale, streaked with red-veined clouds like old blood left to rot. Behind him, the sounds of forge hammers echoed through the mountain. Laughter from the lower market halls bounced off stone like wind chimes. Dwarven children raced through tunnels under their mothers, scolding. The mountain lived, and it never expected to die. A shadow moved across the sun. The birds, hundreds of them, erupted from the forest edge like ash from a vent. Balin froze. His eyes fixed northward, the black shape growing larger in the sky didn't flap like a bird. It surged, it coiled the air around it. The mountain groaned, he shouted too late. The front gate shattered, the blast of flame wasn't a wave, it was a wall. The stone around the entry buckled inward as if the mountain bowed. The guard post exploded into light. Dwarves turned to cinder mid-step. Balin stumbled backward, the blast wave throwing him against the pillar behind. A roar, a scream, no voice, only thunder-given hunger Smaug. He came not with menace but with certainty. No hesitation, no cruelty, just purpose. Within minutes the gold-veined corridors turned black. Torchlight flickered and vanished in the roar of wind and fire. Inside the king's chamber, Thror stood silent. From his high balcony he watched. As the vaults he'd filled, the pride he'd polished melted into rivers. He didn't call for guards, he didn't run. He clenched the sides of his throne, as though they could hold the mountain together. He did not see his grandson running through the smoke. Thorin sprinted through collapsing halls, blade drawn, his beard singed and lungs burning. He called for Balin, for his brother, for anyone. The deeper he went, the fewer voices answered. The fire was not chasing him. It was ahead of him, winding through tunnels like breath from a demon. From the vaults came a sound, not rage, but pleasure. Smaug's laughter was a rumble felt through the bones of the mountain. He was not burning for hate, he burned to nest. In the heart of Erebor, the dragon twisted through treasure like a serpent through leaves. The coins hissed under his scales. Statues cracked beneath his tail. Gems vanished into his yawning, fire-lit mouth. No guards challenged him. The few who tried were charred where they stood. One brave soul threw a spear. It clinked against a gold ingot. Smaug never noticed. The western corridors collapsed one by one. Smoke funneled through the Blackstone canals. The Black River, once, used to ferry goods to the outer lands, boiled from beneath. Screams never reached the surface. At the western stair, a dozen dwarves made their stand. They bore axes blackened by soot, shields cracked from falling stone, but none retreated. Behind them, the side tunnel wound upward toward the hidden exit. They did not guard the stair to hold it. They stood because no one else would. Thorin joined them. His eyes were wild, soot covering his face like war paint. His voice was hoarse, no longer calling names, only roaring back at the fire. They struck down two beastlings that surged ahead of the dragon's heat, twisted lizard things pulled from the deepest dark. But when Smaug's breath seared the stair itself, stone turned to steam and fire coated everything. The stair vanished behind flame. Thorin crawled from the ash with half his cloak gone, his arm burned, his legs shaking. But the tunnel opened to starlight. They reached the exit. The survivors, a mere handful, stumbled into the night outside Erebor. The mountains stood behind them like a torch, casting golden light into the valley of Dale. No one spoke. Thror collapsed. Balin wept. Thorin turned back. A single ember still clung to his hand. He rubbed it between thumb and finger. The heat was gone, but it had left something behind. He looked up and swore, beneath stars that still dared to shine, that one day Erebor would burn again, but under dwarven fire.
Title: The Goblin King's Shadow. The Goblin King was dead. His twisted crown, forged from bones and scraps of dwarven gold, lay shattered beside his crumpled corpse in the throne chamber of Gorgaznul, the Deep Nest. No goblin knew what killed him. Some whispered poison, others spoke of elvish curses. But one truth remained: the deep throne was empty, and war had come to the tunnels. In the black halls below the misty mountains, the goblin tribes fractured. What had once been a brutal but unified swarm was now 6 feuding warbands, each ruled by one of the king's spawn, sons bred for treachery and torment. Grawl the Hook Hand, cruel and loud, held the upper mines. Scrag-Ear, a sneering torturer, ruled the pit kennels. Draug the Claw-Mouth, born with tusks on both lips, controlled the chasm bridges. The others, lesser and meaner, held wormholes, rot tunnels, and bone markets. But then, there was Nor. Nor was a secret. He had no tusks, no goblin eyes, no green-gray skin. His face was pale, his limbs long and thin. He moved quietly, ate little, and never laughed. Raised in the deepest dark, in silence, by the king's old bone priestess, he was told he was the clever one, the forgotten one, the one meant for more. Nor listened. He learned. He watched his brothers kill, enslave, betray, and then he whispered into the walls. The shadows answered. When the warbands began to clash, Nor struck. First, he sent whispers into Grawl's tunnels that Scrag had poisoned the king. Grawl attacked without warning, tearing through 2 layers before realizing he'd been baited. Then he set flame maggots loose in Draug's breeding pits. Half his army was eaten alive in minutes. Nor never showed his face, but his signs were everywhere, mangled. Scribes, missing teeth, bone sigils carved into tunnel walls. Goblins began to whisper, "The Shadow Prince walks. He sees without light." He was born from the rock itself. One night, Scrag-Ear led his remaining soldiers into the crown tunnel, where the throne chamber lay. He found the hall dark, the torches out, the bones of the king still unburied, and there, in the throne, sat Nor, alone. He wore no crown, no armor, only a cloak made from batskin and stitched tongues. "You dare sit there?" Scrag hissed, drawing a rusted blade. Nor did not rise. He did not move. Instead he said, "You were never the king's son. You were his blade, a hound. And now, you've bitten your last throat." From the darkness they came, tunnel walkers, silent goblins bred in shadow, loyal only to Nor. They fell upon Scrag's army like a storm. Nor didn't even blink. By the next night, 5 of the 6 war bands were ash and blood. Nor moved through the deep nest like a ghost. He did not bark orders, he whispered them, and every goblin obeyed. They called him the Pale Claw, the White Hunger, the Shadow that Learns. But none dared call him what he truly was. Then came the Horn of Dwarogrim. From the outer tunnels came a sound not heard in 100 years, a dwarven war horn. The sons of Erebor were tunneling eastward, reclaiming ancient forges. And they were coming for Gorgaznul. The goblins panicked. The clans fractured again, until Nor appeared at the bone spire and said just one thing: "Let them come." When the dwarves arrived, fire in hand, war machines behind them, they found the tunnels quiet, too quiet. The first 20 warriors never returned, neither did the second. Then they saw the walls move, not stone, not shadow, goblin eyes, thousands. Nor stood above them on a rock altar, arms outstretched like wings. He did not scream, he did not rage, he simply pointed, and the swarm descended. It wasn't a battle, it was erasure. The dwarves were pulled into holes screaming, flames spilled, but the goblins drank it. Steel rang, but the goblins learned. Each fallen dwarf taught them something new, and Nor remembered it all. When the blood dried, Nor entered the throne room once more. He sat on the deep throne. This time, no one questioned him. The goblins had a king again. Not one of tooth and rage, but one of silence, memory, and shadow. They say Nor is still down there, waiting, learning, and that when the mountains fall, he'll rise again, not to reclaim tunnels, but to teach the surface what the dark remembers.
The siege of Cirith Nargil. There was no dawn in Cirith Nargil. The high pass lay buried between the jagged bones of the Efelduath Mountains, cold, wind-bitten and forgotten. For decades, Gondor had manned the outpost atop its cliffs with only a dozen men at a time. It was a formality, a shadowed relic of a war no one believed would return until the drums came. Captain Halros stood at the edge of the watchtower, cloak snapping in the wind. Below, thick fog blanketed the valley like spilled milk. But within the fog, they moved. Dark shapes, dozens, hundreds, not the squealing goblins of old. These were taller, black-armored, disciplined. They bore no banners, no torchlight, only silence. He turned to his second, a boy no older than 25, named Renil. The lad had never seen war. He thought bravery was about speeches and swords raised to the sky. Halros handed him a helmet instead. "Put it on," he said. Renil stared at the horn of warning. "Should we sound it?" Halros looked back over the wall. The fog had reached. The stairs. "No, that horn's for help. There's no one left to hear it." Inside the stone fortress, 10 men prepared what they could. Barrels were rolled into place. Arrows were stacked. Fire oil was stirred. There was no shouting, no prayers, just the rhythm of readiness, the sound of men who knew they might not outlive the sunset and had already made peace with that. Then the wind died, and the fog spoke. Not in words, but in the clink of boots on stone, in the grind of steel, in the steady drumbeat of approaching death. Halros stepped onto the top wall as a dozen black-armored Uruk-hai broke through the fog. They didn't charge. They assembled. Shields lifted, spears raised, in perfect formation. Behind them, more shapes marched into view. One of them, cloaked in furs and black leather, stepped forward and slammed a pike into the stone. He had no helm, just a face covered in deep scars and a single white handprint across his cheek. Halros spat over the side. "You're not in Isengard anymore," he muttered. The orc looked up and smiled. The siege began with fire. Rocks slung by crude trebuchets slammed into the side walls, cracking stone and collapsing part of the south stairwell. A flaming pot of pitch struck the roof of the eastern chamber, the mess hall. Smoke poured from the slit windows. The men didn't run. They shifted. By nightfall, the orcs had breached the outer wall. The courtyard became a killing pit. 2 Gondorian spearmen fell before the others forced the Uruks back. Halros led the charge, blade notched and blackened, his shoulder bleeding from a thrown hatchet. Renil fought beside him, no longer looking like a boy. "Back to the tower," Halros ordered. "We collapse the stair behind." Midnight. 6 Gondorians remained, backs to the wall of the inner keep. The fortress groaned with each strike. Orcs climbed the crumbled stones like spiders. Halros stood at the front, breathing hard. His blade had snapped in half. Renil, crouched behind him, looked too. "The horn again," sounded, Halros said. "But you said—" "I know what I said." Renil lifted the horn and blew. The sound cut through the night like a dying wind. Echoes bounced off dead stone. No reply came. But it didn't matter. Halros turned to the men. "This isn't for rescue. This is for memory. Let Gondor remember." Who held the gate? The final breach came like a flood. Orcs stormed through the rubble, howling, blades raised. One by one the defenders fell. Spears snapped, shields broke. Blood sprayed against stone older than kings. Halros struck down the lead Uruk with the horn spike still in his chest. Renil fell beside him, smiling through bloodied teeth. And Halros stood alone, eyes blazing, back straight, until even the drums stopped. At sunrise, the pass was silent. The fog receded, revealing the ruined outpost. But from the highest wall, wind still whispered through the broken horn, a memory caught in stone. And from far to the west, in Minas Tirith, a scribe would later write, "Cirith Nargil has fallen, but it did not surrender."
The broken gate of the dwarves. Long before the shadow of the Third Age spread over Gondor and Rohan, before Barad-dûr blackened the sky, there existed a stronghold lost to memory. Hidden in the roots of the Ephel Duath, the Mountains of Shadow, it was called by those who knew of it Thangrud Bizarre, the Gate of Broken Echoes, a dwarven city forged in secret by the Stone Soul clan. Thangrud Bizarre was no place of song or merriment. It was born of exile. After Durin's folk were scattered from Khazad-dûm's western halls, and the eastern peaks fell silent, those dwarves who refused to wander fled south. There, beneath blackened mountains, where even the birds did not dare perch, they carved a new kingdom, cloaked in secrecy. The dwarves of Thangrud Bizarre were known not by tales, but by their steel. Their forges burned mithril blue, and their hammers never ceased. They wore silence like armor and fury like flame, but the shadow was always watching. As the power of Mordor waxed, word reached the ears of the Dark Lord's captains, rumors of dwarf steel that could resist flame, of weapons untouched by rust, of mithril artifacts that pulsed with hidden light. This could not be left unchecked, and so Sauron summoned Rakshar, a war chief not born but bred in the pits of Gorgoroth, a beast of an orc, twice the height of men, cloaked in chainmail stitched with troll sinew. His halberd was black as pitch and glowed red at the edges, quenched in the blood of men and strengthened in fire that no elf could bear. With him came 10,000 orcs goblins, wargs, and beasts unknown to even the most ancient tomes. Together they marched into the crags, hungry for ruin. But the dwarves did not tremble. Thrain Stonefire, warlord of the Stone Soul clan, last of the Ember Kings, was old, scarred, and quiet. He wore a beard braided with molten chain and armor etched in rune prayers whispered only in the dark. When the horns of war echoed in the caverns, he rose from the hall of anvils and spoke only this: "Let them come. They will break teeth upon our gate." The first wave hit under a moonless sky. Flaming tar fell like weeping comets. The orcs brought towers of bone, siege beasts clad in rusted iron, and battering rams carved from ancient oaks felled in blasphemy. The dwarves met them with fire, not flames of destruction, but light. Burning blue-white, their braziers sent shafts of searing purity into the night. For 3 days the gates held. For 3 nights the mountain bled ash. On the 4th, Thrain opened the gates, not to parley, but to charge. The dwarves surged forth like a river of steel. Hammers sang, shields shattered skulls. Thrain led them, a walking mountain of rage, felling 2 trolls before his hammer cracked. Then they pulled back, sealing the gates behind them. Not a word spoken, not a boast made, just the silence of war. But the darkness pressed harder. On the 6th night, the first tier was lost. The orcs had tunneled, sending waves from beneath, erupting like boils through the stone. The dwarves retreated inward, sealing hall after hall with rune-locked gates. But even stone has its limits. On the 7th day, the wind changed. It blew not from the east, but from the north, carrying with it the smell of green things and the hum of elvish song. Then, from the cliffs above the siege, came Silva. Calaneth, bow maiden of greenwood, rode like a ghost from legend. She and her company of 200 moon riders had journeyed through shadow, following omens and stars. They were few, but their arrows flew with ancient vengeance. From the heights they loosed death. The field turned silver with fletched fury. Wargs howled, trolls screamed, the orc horde staggered under the weight of beauty made lethal. Raukshar snarled and raised his halberd. A black mist surged from its blade, and the sky darkened. Lightning struck the cliffs, trees twisted in agony. But Calaneth did not flinch. She rode down through the ashes, blade spinning, her steed armored in living bark and starlight. Wherever she rode, hope kindled. For a moment, the dwarves believed. Then came the final push. On the 9th day, Raukshar breached the Gate of Thorns, the last barrier to the forge hall, the heart of Thangrud Bazaar. Flames poured in, stone cracked, dwarves died with hammers in hand. Thrain, bloodied, beard scorched, stood before the anvil of kings, the center of the forge, the oldest stone. Around him, the last of his kin made a circle. Behind him, the ember forge still burned. Then Raukshar entered. He filled the hall like a shadow taking form. His halberd dragged across the floor, leaving a trail of sparks. Thrain raised his hammer, eye locked on the beast. "I do not kneel," he said. "You will crack," Raksha spat. And they fought. Stone shuddered, fire dimmed. Their duel was not a battle, it was thunder in flesh. Raksha struck like a serpent. Thrain answered like the mountain. Each blow echoed down the halls through time itself. On the 12th strike, Thrain's leg gave. He roared, but did not fall. On the 15th, Raukshar's arm was torn from his shoulder, and on the 16th, the forge collapsed. Stone fell from the ceiling as Calaneth arrived. She saw Thrain fall, saw Raukshar, wounded, staggering. With a cry and Cinderin, she loosed her last arrow, not at the beast, but at the keystone above the forge. The mountain screamed. 1,000 tons of stone crushed Raukshar, sealing him in a tomb of fire and shadow. The forge cracked, flooding molten light into the halls. Thrain's body was never found. Calaneth carried his hammer from the rubble. In the ruins above, she placed it on a blackened stone. On it she carved in Elvish and Kuzdul. Here fell the fire that could not be quenched. Let the West remember. And the mountain was silent. Years passed. When Elendil's army came, they found no fortress, only rubble, no dwarves, no enemies, only a hammer, weathered but unbroken. They say in storm over the Ephel Duath, thunder sounds not like wrath, but like a hammer striking stone. And in the deep earth, where forges once glowed and dwarves sang in silence, the fire still sleeps, waiting.
The last war under the mountain. The horn echoes still. It once rang from the highest vaults of Khazad-dûm, crafted from blackstone and gold leaf. Now, shattered, it lay beside its bearer, Dwalin Ironmark, captain of the guard, his throat opened by an Uruk blade. They came not like goblins. They came in silence. Uruk-hai. Taller, stronger, armored in steel and discipline. They did not hiss, or chatter, or shriek. They marched, shoulder to shoulder, through the halls the dwarves had bled to reclaim. It was Balin's dream to see Khazad-dûm reborn. But dreams die in shadow. The dwarves fought from the second hall, defending the bridge above the Dimral stair. Arrows clanged against columns. Axes flashed silver in the torchlight. "Hold the flank!" shouted Oin, rallying his kin. Blood soaked his beard, but he stood firm. Ori, the scribe, stood beside him, no warrior, but he fired bolts from a heavy crossbow with trembling hands. The sound of marching never stopped. The Uruk-hai came from 3 directions. When they breached the upper walkway, it wasn't goblin chaos. It was formation. Strategy. The dwarves began to fall. They pulled back toward the east gate, the doors of Durin, facing the lake. The passage narrowed, and here they made their stand. 10 dwarves. The last, "Barak Khazad! Khazad e Iminu!" They roared, axes raised. A charge met them, black iron and red eyes. Stone cracked. Blood sprayed. Oin fell, screaming curses until his voice gurgled out. Ori dropped his crossbow and picked up Oin's axe, swinging blindly. His ink-stained hand shook, not with fear, but rage. He died standing. And then they were 4. Balin, Nori, Brock, Thrain. And Balin, Lord of Moria, still wore his red cloak, now torn and burned. His helm had been lost, his crown dented. Yet his eyes remained bright. He looked back at the gate, the outline of the elvish inscription faint in the moonlight from outside. "So close!" he whispered. He raised his warhammer and pointed to the dark corridor where fresh footfalls echoed. "We hold." They fought like sons of the first forge. Uruk-hai fell. Dwarves bled. Nori lost his arm, but kept swinging with the other. Brock shoved a broken spear into an Uruk's throat before 3 others impaled him. Thrain, Balin's cousin, guarded the gate lever. "Balin!" he cried. "Now!" The Lord of Moria turned too late. A black arrow pierced his gut. He dropped to his knees. Still breathing. Still watching. Thrain pulled the lever. The doors of Durin groaned. The stone shifted, ancient gears grinding. Moonlight poured in, silver on black water. The Uruk-hai surged again. Thrain roared, hurling himself into them to buy time. Balin crawled, bleeding, wheezing, toward the pool outside. He reached the threshold. The moon touched his face. And then the gate slammed shut behind him. Silence. He lay at the edge of the water, staring up at the stars through the valley of Dimmerl Dale. Somewhere inside, screams still echoed. He didn't hear them. He only heard the horn, the one that called him home.
There are names in the records of Durrance folk that even the elves forget. They lie buried in ledgers, deep in the vaults of Erebor, scrawled in ink grown faint with time. Yet among dwarves, memory is not held in pages, it is held in iron, in stone, and in the weight of things passed from hand to hand. One such weight was a plain warhammer. No name, no inscription, no jewel set into its haft. But it had a history, and that history began with Gror, son of Dani, long before dragons stirred the gold in the lonely mountain. The hammer was forged not in the heart of Erebor, but in the outposts of the Grey Mountains, where dwarves once mined silver and obsidian, until the cold and the dragons made the land unlivable. Gror was young then, though already broad-shouldered and black-bearded like his kin, and had earned the weapon in the tunnels of Mount Gundabad during a siege most now forget. But this tale is not of that war, it is of the one that followed. The skirmish at the Teeth of Snow. It was in the year 2785 of the Third Age, when the folk of Run, cruel men from beyond the Sea of Grass, began probing the eastern flanks of Erebor. They did not come with full armies, but with fast, quiet raiders who struck at caravans and border halls. Word came of iron-tipped spears, of dwarf merchants dragged from their wagons, and of cave mouths burned and looted. Gror, then lord of a small stronghold east of Erebor, rode to meet them not with a host, but with 30 loyal dwarves, smiths, miners, and warriors both. They made their stand in a narrow pass called the Teeth of Snow, where ice broke into jagged columns and cliffs offered only one way through. There that Gror first felt the true burden of legacy, for he knew that if they failed, the raiders would find a path to Erebor's heart. The Warhammer's song. The hammer he carried was heavy, though not in weight. It bore the scratches of orc helmets, the cracks of goblin shields. Its face was square and scarred, but Gror's hand fit it like an old friend. He said no words to it, nor gave it a name. Dwarves, he said, needed no poetry for good tools. The Easterlings came at dusk, 5 for every dwarf. They wore long robes over armor of bone and bronze. Their chief bore a crescent axe and spoke no words, only lifted a black banner and pointed forward. The first charge broke against the dwarves like a tide. Spears shattered on stone. Gror fought not like a king, but like a tunnel watcher, close, brutal, without waste. The hammer rose and fell, crushing jaw and helm alike. It made no music, only meat and metal and the sound of war. His shield splintered. His helm was cracked. But the pass held. For hours they fought in freezing mist under the shadows of cliffs that bore witness to an old world. And then came the chieftain of Run. He was tall, broad, marked in red from head to heel. His axe could split a stone block clean. With one swing, he felled 3 dwarfs. Gror stepped forward, battered but unbowed, and met him at the narrowing of the pass. They did not speak, they fought. The turning, the hammer met the axe. Once, twice. On the third clash, the haft of Gror's weapon cracked, but the head did not fall. He dropped the splintered shaft and caught the hammer's weight barehanded. Gritting his teeth, he drove it low, into the Easterling's knee, then swung again. With both arms, overhead, bone cracked. The chieftain fell. The line of Run broke. The raiders fled into the dark, but Gror sank to one knee. He had taken a blade under the ribs in the final blow, deep and crooked. His blood steamed on the snow. The farewell, they carried him back to Erebor. The wound festered. No balm nor dwarf healer could root it out. On his final night, he sat with his son, a younger dwarf, red-haired, quiet-eyed. Gloin. Gror pressed the hammer, bound in cloth, into his son's hands. "Keep it near," he said. "It has work yet to do." Then he slept, and woke no more. The line continued. Gloin bore the hammer when he stood at the gates of Erebor during the war of the dwarves and orcs. He carried it across the wastes when Smaug took the mountain. He set it beside his bedroll when he crossed the misty mountains, and again when he sat in Elrond's hall in Rivendell. And one day his son, a certain bold-hearted dwarf named Gimli, gripped it in his own hands, not as his chosen weapon, but as a symbol of where he had come from, of who had come before. Yet he did not know how this warhammer would one day touch the fate of Middle-earth.
Title: The Stand at Caradhun. In the frozen edge of the north, built into the side of the Skycleaver Mountains, stood Caradhun, a dwarven city not carved within, but upon the heights themselves. Its famed skywall, a battlement of ancient stone, loomed above sheer cliffs, overlooking the world like a crown of ice and fire. For centuries, it had never been breached. But times had changed. The Allag-hai returned, not from the east, but from the north, through black glaciers where no maps reached. They came not with hordes of orcs but with siege monsters, frost-covered behemoths, and crude war engines carved from icebound stone. Their leader was called Skorgrak the Howler, a monstrous Allag twice the size of a troll, draped in frozen chains and wielding a war maul embedded with teeth from slain beasts. His roars cracked icebergs. His breath steamed in the cold. They descended on Caradhun like an avalanche. The dwarves had little warning. Horns were blown. Bells rang deep within the mountain. Dorian Frostmail, High Captain of the Skywall, stood in the snow-lashed wind. His beard was rimed with ice. His armor bore scars from battles long past. He squinted into the storm. "Giants," he muttered. "They've come to climb." Beside him, Brinna Hearthhand, master engineer, lit the fire wells, rows of metal cauldrons brimming with oil along the wall's edge. The dwarves readied their bolts, axes, and burning pitch. No tunnels to collapse this time. No narrow pass to trap the beasts. This would be fought above the clouds. At dawn, the enemy reached the base of the cliff. They roared. Skorgrak raised his maul and smashed it against the glacier, shattering it. Behind him, smaller Allag-hai, still giants to men, dragged siege hooks, ropes, and clawed towers fitted with battering stakes. They meant to climb the wall. As the first iron claws found stone, Brinna shouted, "Fire!" Boiling oil cascaded over the edge. Trolls screamed and fell, but more came. Bolts the size of spears launched from dwarven scorpions slammed into Allag flesh, driving some back. But Skorgrak climbed through the fire, laughing. He slammed a grappling claw into the stone and began his ascent. Dorian saw the monster rise and grabbed a great spear forged from the fang of a drake. He stood above the central tower and waited. But Skorgrak was faster than he looked. He reached the battlements in minutes, crushing the first dwarf he met beneath his foot. Dorian charged. Their clash shook the wall. Hammer met maul. Stone shattered. The dwarves around them fought desperately, Allags breaching along the flanks. Bodies fell from the sky into the abyss below. Brinna and her gunners reloaded the flame jets, pipes built into the walls, usually used to melt ice. Today, with a scream, they became weapons. She opened the vents. Fire lanced outward, scorching the cliffside. 5 Allags lost their grip and plummeted, their screams trailing into silence. Still more climbed. Dorian's spear cracked. Skorgrak roared and slammed him backward. The dwarf captain lay broken against the tower stones. Brinna ran to him, grabbed the fallen Drakefang's spear, and turned. "Come then, monster!" Skorgrak lunged, but she dodged and plunged the spear beneath his chin. It cracked through jaw and skull. The beast fell back over the battlement, dragging half a dozen Allags with him as he tumbled into the clouds. A silence fell, followed by dwarven cheers. But the battle wasn't done. The siege towers now reached the wall's edge. From them poured more trolls, war beasts, and frost-shrouded berserkers. The dwarves were outnumbered. Brinna pulled the horn from Dorian's belt. She blew it, 3 long blasts. A moment passed. Then came the answer drums. From within the Skycleaver Mountains, the deep guard rose, ironclad warriors who had not marched in 2 generations. Led by Thorim Colhart, they emerged from the inner gates and struck the flanking trolls with vengeance forged in silence. Axes sang. Hammers roared. The wall turned red. By twilight, the last of the Allag-hai had fallen or fled into the storm. Dorian was carried below, alive but broken. Brinna stood atop the battlements, bloodied and burned. She looked across the horizon, where frost still danced, and said, "Let the mountains remember. This wall stands." Years later, the sky wall of Caradhun remained untouched. Visitors spoke of scorch marks in the stone, and a spear mounted in the tower, half cracked, still red. And they say that when the wind howls through the north, it sometimes sounds like a giant screaming as it falls forever.
The fall of Osgiliath. The river ran black with ash. The sky above Osgiliath was no longer blue nor grey, but red, stained with firelight, stretched thin by smoke. Gondor's once great capital stood in silence, its white stones scorched, its bridges crumbled. What had been a beacon of Númenórean pride now stood as a wall against ruin, and ruin had come. Faramir stood on the broken parapets of the western bank, watching shadows ripple on the far shore. The water whispered, choked with the corpses of men and orcs alike. Behind him, only 40 rangers remained, bloodied, bone-weary, and already mourning. The orcs had crossed the river by night. And not just orcs. Uruk-hai, stronger, faster, smarter. They moved like soldiers, not beasts. Their black banners had no sigil, only a white hand smeared like a wound across cloth. Saruman had sent his war into Gondor while Rohan slept. The first push came at dawn. The eastern towers fell in silence. The enemy came by raft, by swimming in armor, by climbing the very ruins Gondor had abandoned. Arrows rained. Stones fell. Faramir's archers held them off for hours, but the Uruks never broke. They advanced. Through fire, Faramir ordered the bridge destroyed. It shattered under flame, but some orcs were already across. They did not run. They fortified. By nightfall, Osgiliath belonged to no one. Inside the western citadel, Captain Madril traced his finger across a blood-stained map. They mean to take the causeway. If they do, Ithilion's lost. Faramir nodded. We hold the riverbank. We hold the city. A younger ranger, barely more than a boy, looked up. Why? There's nothing left. Faramir's eyes burned with quiet steel. There's still Gondor. The next day, the real siege began. Uruks built makeshift bridges. Trolls dragged siege carts. From the ruins came screams and drums, and among them fell beasts circled, winged monsters, that carried Nazgul in silence above the river. One was coming now. Faramir stood alone atop the battlement, wind pulling at his cloak. As the Nazgul dove, he lifted his bow and loosed. The arrow struck true, glancing off armor. The creature screamed and veered away. The men behind him cheered, briefly. Then the catapults roared. The walls shook. Fire lit the rooftops. The eastern quarter was gone. Faramir gave the order. Fall back to the dome. Light the beacon. We hold until Minas Tirith sees us burn. They ran through broken archways and shattered marble, through halls once trod by kings. In the central dome of stars, the last standing monument of old Osgiliath, they made their final stand. 10 rangers, one Lord's son, surrounded. When the Uruks breached the outer courtyard, they did not roar. They marched, shields up, spears. Locked, the rangers met them like ghosts, striking from shadows, vanishing through smoke. Faramir fought with sword and torch, the flames reflecting in the blood on his blade. Madril died first, 3 spears through his chest. He never cried out. The others fell beside him, one by one, until only Faramir stood beneath the shattered dome, surrounded by bodies, his cloak tattered, his sword cracked, and the firelight rising behind him. He turned to the beacon. The torch still burned, and in the distance, across the river, through the red haze, a reply, a flame rising in Minas Tirith. Hope, Faramir smiled, not with joy, but with duty fulfilled. Then darkness swept over the city, and the Nazgul screamed. Later, much later, the Fellowship would stand at the western gates of Osgiliath. They would pass the ruins, see the bridges broken, smell the ash and rot, but they would not know the names. They would not know how long the city stood, or who stood in its last light. Only that the river had run red, and Gondor had not knelt.
The north ridge burned. A flood of orcs rushed through a shattered grove gate, laughing, chanting, dragging a cart with a siege bomb, black powder stolen from the east and meant to reduce the Yavanna tree to splinters. Ilarion arrived first. He leapt from a fallen trunk and drove his blade into the bomb wagon's lead orc, shattering the wood wheel and sending the fuse rolling into mud. Behind him, elves surged with screams in Quenya and Sindarin, colliding with the orcs in a desperate, brutal melee. An orc captain met Ilarion blade for blade, until Bregular stomped into the ridge. You shall not poison her. His fist crushed earth and enemy alike. He picked up a burning trunk and hurled it into the siege wagon, igniting a chain reaction that engulfed the ridge in smoke and fire. Dozens died. Ilarion coughed blood, covered in ash, but the line held. But from the shadow of the veil, Gashkel emerged. 9 feet tall, cloaked in black scale, wielding a blade carved from a dragon's rib, he moved with terrifying precision. He cut through elven lines, killing 5 warriors in seconds, and charged toward the Yavanna tree. Ilarion ran to meet him. They clashed beneath the roots, sword against serrated bone, ancient oath against endless hate. Gashkel laughed. The forest burns. And you, little lightling, will watch it die. Behind him, orcs surged toward the sanctuary. Ents fell like towers. The Yavanna tree shimmered as its bark began to crack under assault. Then Bregular stepped between them. He struck the ground with his full weight, cracking it, knocking back all enemies near the tree. I was born of her root, he said, and I shall fall with her breath. He picked up Gashkel in both arms. The warlord screamed and stabbed, but Bregular did not let go. May your ashes feed her rebirth. And then he leapt into the flaming gorge, taking Gashkel with him. The forest held. The orcs, leaderless and dying, broke. Elves wept and sang. The Ents who survived returned to the deep woods, fewer than ever. Bregular's name was carved into the Yavanna tree, which still glows faintly on moonless nights. And Ilarion, now old and grey, tells the tale to any who will listen. The forest remembers. Title: The Roots of Wrath. The ground split open with the force of 1,000 marching boots. Flaming arrows streaked through the canopy, igniting silverleaf trees. The screams of dying oaks and elves filled the air like a choir of agony. Hold the line! Shouted Commander Ilarion, his voice barely rising above the clash of steel and the roar of burning bark. His golden armor was scorched, his eyes wild, bow forgotten. He now fought with twin swords slick with orc blood. Beside him, an Ent charged forward, Bregular of the Westgrove, a towering being of living wood and root, his arms splintered but unyielding. He swung a massive branch like a club, shattering 5 orcs in a single sweep. But there were too many. From the black marshes, they came, 40,000 orcs, led by the warlord Gashkel the Vile, riding beasts stitched from warg and corpse, screaming the war chant of the dark flame. This was no raid. It was annihilation. Only days before, the elves of Tirlandrilas had gathered in peace. They sang under moonlight, tending the great Yavanna tree, oldest in the east, whose roots whispered to the Ents and gave life to all the forest. But the Ents had heard rumbling. They felt axes in distant soil. They smelled ash in the roots. They warned of something vast moving beneath the land. The warning came too late. The orcs marched under cover of smoke, dragging catapults, burning saplings as they went. They did not come for conquest. They came to defile. When the attack began, the elves answered with flame arrows and blade dancers. The Ents tore stone from the hills and built root walls overnight. But nothing stopped the tide. Ilarion stood on the ridge overlooking the Vale of Roots, now a battlefield of churned mud and fire. His once pristine war cloak was in tatters, his arms shaking from endless combat. He watched as an elder Ent, over 200 feet tall, was felled by chained trolls with iron axes. The tree being fell with a thunderous groan that shattered stone. We must hold this line, he told Bregular. If the Yavanna tree falls, then the forest dies. The Ent rumbled. Suddenly, a horn echoed from the north ridge. The orcs had breached the glade wall. Ilarion's heart sank. That was their last barrier before the sanctuary. Without hesitation he turned. With me! All who can still fight, now! A handful of warriors followed, many limping, bleeding, but none hesitated. Bregaler did not speak. He simply ripped his roots from the earth and charged.